The shout tore through the dining hall like a glass shattering against the floor. "You're disposable!" The sound was so loud it made two couples at the next table turn their heads at the exact same time. A waiter balancing crystal glasses froze mid-step, hesitating with the weight tilting in his hands. And the manager, standing at the center of the aisle, stopped completely, shoulders stiff, expression petrified, unable to decide whether to run to help or to hide. And at the center of it all, the waitress. Julia Marin was still holding the tray, her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't blink, didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes. She just stood there, unmoving, as if every second of that humiliation was being recorded in her memory, with no intention of being erased. Peter Langford, the most feared and most arrogant billionaire on Park Avenue, stood towering above her, his face tense, jaw locked, as if he weren't shouting at just her, but at the entire world, demanding everyone witness his superiority. "I said, you're disposable," he repeated, now lower, but still dripping with venom. The dining hall fell into a cold kind of silence. A silence that hurt. Julia, however, simply took a slow breath, soft, calm, almost elegant, and lowered the tray as if she weren't returning glasses to the table, but returning dignity. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that make your blood boil. Minutes before that explosive moment, the Elysian Hall restaurant pulsed with its usual luxury. Amber lights reflected across polished marble, crystal glasses chimed like tiny bells, and the aroma of white truffles drifted through the air like a cloud of prestige. The waitress moved between the tables with her always impeccable posture, measured steps, attentive eyes, quiet voice, professional smile. She was the kind of employee customers remembered, not for what she did, but for the silent way she made everything seem effortless. But that night, chaos had a name: Peter Langford. A billionaire CEO, heir to a global conglomerate, known more for humiliating employees than for investing in technology. He had already complained about the temperature of the wine, the shine of the table, the lighting that didn't match his mood, and even the placement of the flowers. Julia took every complaint with the same calm, but each of his words pushed him a little closer to the moment he would explode. And then, he exploded. When the water Julia poured left a thin line down the rim of the glass almost invisible, a mistake anyone would ignore, he stood up. And he yelled. The entire room watched. Julia felt the hot wave of shame try to rise inside her. But she also felt something else. A different weight, a silent certainty, something Peter had no idea lived inside her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Because even though he had screamed that she was disposable, destiny, that night, had prepared something that would make many people swallow hard. Especially him. In the mind of that simple waitress, as the whole room watched, an unusual thought was already forming. You have no idea who is truly disposable here. If what he just did already made you furious, hit the like button now, because what comes next is even more outrageous. The restaurant had resumed part of its routine after Peter's verbal attack, but not completely. Some customers still glanced discreetly at the waitress, as if trying to understand how someone so calm could endure that level of humiliation without breaking inside. Little did they know that Julia Marin was not the type of woman who broke. She was the kind of woman who silently collected pieces. Pieces that, when assembled, formed something far larger than anyone there could imagine. Julia stepped away from the billionaire's table with controlled movements, but inside her, her thoughts were racing in directions no one would have ever guessed. That wasn't the first time she had seen Peter Langford. And certainly not the first time he had underestimated her. He just didn't remember. And Julia preferred it that way. Her focus, in that moment, was elsewhere. From Peter's table, a detail caught her attention. Hastily stacked documents. Poorly reviewed tables. Projections that didn't hold up. Nothing there seemed to have gone through a serious check, but to Peter, they were just good enough pages. Julia drew a deeper breath. International investors were beginning to arrive, men and women with perfect ties, leather briefcases, and gazes sharper than Peter could comfortably handle. They weren't there to dine. They were there to evaluate the future. His future. The arrogant CEO straightened his suit jacket in a rush, irritated, trying to hide the emotional imbalance caused by the earlier outburst. He hated looking weak. And even more, he hated looking wrong. The waitress observed everything from a distance, every detail, every movement. The manager, still embarrassed by Peter's explosion, approached her and whispered, "Are you okay? Do you want to switch sections?" Julia simply shook her head. "I'd rather stay here." When the investors settled at the table, Peter began handing out the presentation copies, the very same pages Julia had seen minutes earlier. And her stomach tightened. The numbers didn't match. The projections were wrong. And the justification for the expansion costs simply made no sense. That wasn't a common mistake. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The CEO, of course, noticed none of this. He was far too busy trying to look brilliant. The waitress walked to the service counter, picked up a black folder and, with the natural confidence of someone who already knew exactly what was about to unfold, placed inside it a few documents she had kept since the beginning of her shift. Documents that contradicted everything Peter was about to present. Documents only she had, because 3 years before taking that simple job, Julia had briefly worked at Peter's own company, assisting on projects he didn't even remember. She knew how he prepared reports. She knew the mistakes he repeated. And above all, she knew what he always ignored. Documents that could save the meeting, or destroy the billionaire who had just called her disposable. Julia closed the folder slowly, as someone who seals a fate, and held it firmly against her chest. Because she knew that at any moment, everything could flip upside down. And no one, not even Peter, would be prepared for it. Peter's presentation had begun with theatrical confidence, but it lasted less than 5 minutes before the first crack appeared. One of the investors, a man with gray hair and a clinical gaze, raised an eyebrow as he flipped through the pages. Then, a woman from the international team crossed her arms, a defensive posture. Another consultant brought his glasses closer to his face, reading the numbers for a second time. The air shifted. It no longer felt like the sophisticated atmosphere of an expensive dinner. It was the subtle, cutting scent of something wrong. "These numbers don't match," the gray-haired investor said firmly, turning another page. "Who prepared this?" The question sliced through Peter like a blade. He swallowed hard, opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally managed to say, "It must have been the intern. The kid messed up the spreadsheet. I didn't review the latest version." The investors exchanged glances. And it became clear. Those mistakes did not come from an intern. They were far too complex for that. And far too dangerous for a meeting of this scale. "Mr. Langford," the woman with glasses said, "these projections are mathematically impossible." Peter tried to respond, but the words simply did not come out. He shifted in his chair, sweat forming on his forehead. The silence grew so dense it felt like it touched the skin. "Julia, water for table 6, a waiter called from across the hall, unaware of what was happening at the investors' table. She approached carefully, tray in hand. But before she could set the pitcher down, the woman with glasses looked at her with sudden recognition. "I know you," she murmured. Peter frowned, confused. "You attended the Global Risk Program 2 years ago, didn't you?" Her tone carried both surprise and genuine recognition. Julia froze for a moment, not out of fear, but because she knew this moment would come sooner or later. Peter tried to reassert control. "She's just a waitress. She doesn't." "Bring her here," the gray-haired investor interrupted. "If I'm not mistaken, she has more training in risk analysis than half the consultants I've met." Peter went pale. "No, she doesn't need to." "Let her speak, Peter," another executive cut in, with a tone that allowed no argument. The room fell completely silent as Julia set the tray on a nearby table and stepped forward, her posture humble but steady. "Ma'am, if I may," she said softly, "there are projections on this page that don't match the calculation base used. If we apply the real rate, the projected growth drops to 6.4%, not 18%. The gray-haired investor flipped through the pages rapidly. His eyes lit up. "She's right," Julia continued, without arrogance, only precision. "Furthermore, this line represents costs that were not deducted from the operating margin. And the proposed expansion doesn't align with the current cash flow. But with these adjustments," she slid a few papers from her folder, "the plan works." The entire table leaned forward, stunned. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who spoke their language with more clarity than Peter had ever shown. And in that moment, it became obvious. She had just saved the presentation. Peter stood frozen, staring at her as if she were a ghost. His trembling hands betrayed the panic his ego was trying desperately to hide. The gray-haired investor turned to Julia with respect. "Miss, would you join us for a moment? We need to speak with you privately." Julia took a deep breath. And nodded. Peter couldn't even raise his voice anymore. The door of the private room closed behind Julia with a soft click, but the sound echoed like a verdict. Inside, far from the noise of the restaurant, the atmosphere was different. Silent gravities, calculated stares, and a mahogany table where decisions worth millions, sometimes billions, were made. Julia remained standing out of respect, but the investors insisted she sit. "Miss Marin," the gray-haired investor began, folding his hands, "we recognize your analysis. And frankly, we're impressed." Julia inhaled slowly, still processing the speed at which her night had changed. "How long have you been working here?" the woman with glasses asked. "A few months," Julia replied simply. "And before that," another director pressed. Julia hesitated. Not out of shame, but because answers carry weight. "I worked," she adjusted her tone, "in financial analysis consultancies. But I had to step away for personal reasons." The executives exchanged glances. And in that silent exchange, Julia realized. They knew exactly what kind of talent was sitting in front of them. "Julia," the woman with glasses said gently but firmly, "there's something you need to know." She slid a white folder across the table. "Our group is restructuring the Global Risk Analysis Division. We are looking for someone competent, precise, resilient, someone who sees what others ignore." The folder stopped right in front of her. "The position is open. And after what we saw today, we'd like you to be the first to consider it." Julia froze. It was as if the world paused for a full second. "Me?" she asked, stunned. "You," the gray-haired investor confirmed with a discreet smile. "And I should add, your work today prevented us from losing tens of millions." Julia blinked slowly, absorbing every word. And then the door swung open. Peter entered without being invited. "What's going on here?" His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. The investors simply stared at him, cold, distant, evaluating him from an angle he had never experienced before. "We're discussing the leadership position in the global division, with Miss Marin," the gray-haired director replied. Peter stepped forward, offended. "You can't be serious. She's a qualified professional, Peter." The woman with glasses cut in. "Something we can't say about you today, given the errors presented." The silence that followed was devastating. Then came the final blow, delivered with surgical precision. "Peter, looks like she isn't the disposable one here." Peter lost all the color in his face. His eyes searched for something to hold onto, but found nothing. Not even pride. "You are temporarily removed from the board," the gray-haired investor declared. "And you will be investigated for the errors presented." Peter tried to speak, but no words came out. That very night, Julia signed the first documents to assume the position. The pen glided over the pages with the lightness of someone reclaiming the place that had once been taken from her. Peter stood near the door, destroyed, watching. Julia lifted her gaze slowly, met his eyes, and without raising her voice, without triumph, without bitterness, delivered the final sentence. Everyone is disposable when they don't know how to respect people. The words fell between them like a verdict. Not vengeance. Truth. Julia closed the folder, raised her chin with dignity, and walked away from the man who tried to discard the wrong person. Those who see others as small forget the most dangerous truth. It's the ones who work in silence who notice what power tries to hide. And when the truth comes to light, it isn't the humble who fall, it's the one who underestimated them.